In 2024, Millis High School's varsity football program celebrated a special milestone, a century of gridiron action. Everything began in 1922 when $4,000 was appropriated by the town to purchase land for a new town park, and $331.88 was also added to clear it and build a baseball field and a football field in the area. A year later, the baseball diamond and the field was completed and used for both sports. On September 24th, 1924, it was recorded that the Millis football team was defeated by Wellesley by a score of 40-0. This possibly could have been their first game representing the high school. Clyde Brown, who was the principal and possibly a coach, wrote and I'll quote this: "We had a very successful season in football this year. Our equipment in both baseball and football are old and inadequate. The boys have been obliged to buy their own suits, and in some cases it was difficult. There were boys last fall playing without football shoes and helmets. If a small sum were appropriated by the town for sports equipment, it would be a great encouragement." Clyde Brown, 1924. So, 24, first season, 1925, was the first time that the sport was recognized by the school committee. And members of the 25 team included some names that are still around in Millis today. George Caraglanian, whose brother Aram, who was recently inducted into the Millis Athletics Hall of Fame, played on those teams. Wilfred Duhamel, Duhamel's a Millis name. Robert Thorne, Charles Porter Clues, Lewis Thorne, and the head coach was Roland Sawyer. And there was an interesting quote from Mr. Jacob Warsoff, who was a member of the 25, 26, and 27 team and a Millis resident, quoted as saying, "I played football for Millis High School in that celebrated game when Millis scored 108 points and Medfield scored 0. And that was taken from a publication written by Kelly Coster in 1985 about Millis's first 100 years, called Reminiscence. So as we move forward, the teams in the 20s in the 30s became more skilled and competitive because they had uniforms now, they had more players, and there were many players on those teams whose names you will also recognize. Royden Boots Barrett was the great-grandfather of current Millis player Brody Barrett, and Henry Cassidy, who's a Millis name, was the captain of the 30 team. Leslie Simpson, Simon Novick, Joseph Nathanson, prominent families in the town up to this day. Thomas Howie, Carl Olson. Carl Olson was the grandfather of Super Bowl winning coaches Dale and Dana Olson, who coached the Millis teams to successive Super Bowls in 2016 and 17. George Harris, Herbert Smith, Phil Gavin, who was a town moderator eventually, and Arthur Shannon. There was a great story passed on to me from a friend and classmate a year ahead of me named Ruth Harkovitz. Her brothers were very prominent players on a team in 1932, 1933, and their father, who was from Ukraine, and they lived on a farm in Millis on Route 115, told their sons they had to go and talk to Mr. Brown and the coach and tell them that they would not be able to play in the game on Saturday because having a farm, the farm came first and the potatoes were ready to be dug up on the farm. So the sons reluctantly went and told the story to the coach and Mr. Brown. They were not happy, and Mr. Brown, Clyde Brown, who was the principal, arranged a meeting between their father and himself. They had the meeting, they came to a conclusion and resolved the problem. The solution was all the players went up 2 days before the game and dug up the potatoes. They did it 2 days before in case they didn't get all of them on the first day. They still had a day between digging potentially more potatoes in the game. Everything got done, the game was played, and it was a great story and a great solution. The 1936 and 37 teams were coached by Mr. Frederick Welch and Richard McGinnis, and these teams were known as the Reds. The current football field was dedicated to Coach Welch on October 11, 1964, with his wife, Mary, a longtime Millis teacher, and their sons, Bill and John, in attendance. Notable players on some of those teams were George Buckshot Clancy, longtime owner and co-founder of the Charles Restaurant, with Henry McCarthy, who was also a co-founder of the restaurant, who was this year's Millis co-captain Vinnie Sellers' great-grandfather. There was Joe English, Ned Cunningham, Leo McCarthy, who was a 36 captain, Alex Leone, James Clancy, Edward Temelavitz, later who became a coach and teacher in Millis, John Howie, and Paul Bicknell. Interesting note on the 1937 team picture. All the players were in uniform except Mr. Clancy, Buckshot Clancy. And I knew there had to be a good story behind this. Kevin McCarthy, who played in the early 70s, son of Henry McCarthy, who played with Buckshot, and George David Clancy III, who was a quarterback and captain in the 2004 team, and Buckshot's grandson, both told me the same story a couple years apart. So I'm going to go with it. Apparently, Buckshot had climbed a large pine tree in the town park, which is still standing near where the large baseball diamond is, and sort of in front of the bandstand. And he was up in a tree. He decided to come down, and he slipped, he fell, hit the ground, and broke his back. That's why he did not have his uniform on, but he was still part of the team. Getting into the 40s, the 40s teams featuring Ed Temelavitz, Terrence Cassidy, who had the large farm, the Cassidy Farm across from Oak Grove Farm, and George Cassidy, and they were coached by Mr. Nathanson, who had played in the 20s. During World War II, all interclassic sports were abandoned due to the war effort, and many of the men and women serving in the service and trying to preserve our freedom. The 1945 team, when it started again in Millis, featured Buddy Ed Shropshire, a noted historian in town, longtime veteran, Gardner Rice, Fred Pollard, and Joe Cassidy, Seymour Doliner, Donald Ingraham, Dick Newell, and Ted Aykroyd. Mentioning these names because many of you who may hear this story will remember names and get attached to this a little bit. 1949 brought us Don and Red Pettis, Ed Duhamel, and a young but talented ball player named Billy Tate. The 1951 team proved to be the most successful team since the teams of the late 20s. They beat Medway on Thanksgiving for the first time since 1928, winning 33-0. Their record was 5-1-1, losing only to Air. Some people at the time called it Mills' best team ever. Bronco Billy Tate scored 91 points to lead Class D in scoring, and as a result of the Thanksgiving victory, on Monday following the game, Morris Mushnick, who was later a select person in Millis, father of Mickey Mushnick, who played on the team, and a town selectman at the time, threw a banquet at the Meadows in Framingham and footed the bill. Ed Alger, the quarterback, had an outstanding year, completing 71 of 93 passes for almost 1,500 yards and 15 touchdowns. Many of them received statewide individual honors. Donald Cox, first team and all classes on Len Masters' all-state football team, which was a very prestigious team at the time. And he was the first team all-scholastic, all-class D by the Boston Papers. Billy Tate was an all-scholastic and third leading scorer in all of Eastern Massachusetts. Mickey Mushnick was all-scholastic, as were Charlie George Harris, Howard Ingraham, and Don Cox. The newly formed Booster Club, which was formed immediately after the Thanksgiving victory, by George Harris Sr. and Hugh McCarthy Jr., put on a testimonial banquet for the team that was held in the high school gymnasium, which is now the gymnasium in the Veterans Memorial Building. And it was a standing room only crowd in attendance. Everyone wanted to go. So beating Medway for the first time in 1951 since 1928 sort of turned the town upside down. It was a pretty cool thing. So Millis teams became more successful the next few years because many of the 1951 team returned. Coach Parsons and Ed Temilovitz, who I previously mentioned from the 1940 team, led the team in 1953. And an interesting note on Ed Temilovitz, who was a teacher and a coach, as I mentioned. After graduating from Millis, he played football with the legendary Harry Aganis, who many of you may recognize the name, at Boston University. In 1954, Dan Bennett, who later became a coach in Natick with Bob Whalen, they were two Millis residents. Dan became the head coach in Millis, and he stayed on another year in 1955. George Smith, who became Millis's chief of police, was the 54 captain. Bobby Barrett, John Diggins, Don Demetric, Tom Keogh, another outstanding athlete from Millis, highlighted that team. Demetric and Diggins captained the 55 team, which included Paul Robinson, Carl Mighton, Paul Crean, Keogh, and Jimmy White. And the teams of the late 50s were competitive, but saw moderate success, nothing overwhelming with those teams, but they showed up, they played, and they were respectful. In 1960, Paul Scagnelli became the head coach. He was an All-American player at UConn and was recruited by the New York Giants of the NFL, but declined the offer to further his education. Football took an upswing with Scagnelli as coach. He also was the first to institute a junior varsity team, feeling that it was important if we were to be more competitive with other schools. And even though it was 1960, this was probably the beginning of the modern era of Millis football. John Costello and Tom White were captains in 60, with notable players Bernie Roy, whose father was the superintendent, Ricky King, whose uncle Rudolph King was a registrar of motor vehicles in Millis. Richard Watson, Arthur Carter also were outstanding players. The 61 team, along with Scagnelli, added coach Hugo Jajari, a former Holy Cross quarterback who grew up in Ashland as an assistant coach. With these two coaches, interest in the sport grew and the teams became larger in number, leading to more success. With the new junior-senior high school being completed in the early 60s, the football field moved from in front of the original Clyde Brown School in the town park to its present location adjacent to the high school. 62 brought the arrival of Mr. Niles Nelson, who would soon put Millis football back on the map big time. His first teams had only about 40 players. Millis had only 2 winning seasons in the last 15 years prior to his arrival. Only 15 boys showed up at his first practice. He knew he had to rebuild the program, which he did. In 1962, they had 1 win. 63, 3 wins. The 64 team went 8-1, losing only to undefeated Medfield by 1 touchdown. That year, we beat Medway for the first time in 12 years. In 65, Millis did not lose a game, was 9-0 with 7 shutouts, and allowed only 18 points to be scored against them. They were South Central League champions. South Central League became what is now the Tri-Valley League the following year. That year's championship undefeated team was co-captained by Jay Monahan and Joel Howie. Kevin Cushman was the quarterback. Tom Connors, Paul White, Tucky Bates, Richard Braun, Charlie Mosier, Dennis Breen all contributed in a very deep and talented backfield. Rusty Cushman, Gene Correa, Tom Moran, Ron Morgan caught passes. Steve Howie, Cliff Burnett, Jay Monahan, Joel Howie, Mike Healy, and Rob Demetric opened holes for the backs. Al Wilson, Paul Mann, Don Delevskis, Joe Costello, and John Welch were defensive stalwarts. The team finished second in the Class D standings behind Franklin and would have played them if this was during the Super Bowl era. Postseason honors went to Jay Monahan as the first-team All-Scholastic in the Record American, and only 11 players in the state were picked, not 22 or 30, only 11. Also, Boston Herald honorable mention. Rusty Cushman was a Boston Globe honorable mention and Boston Herald honorable mention All-Scholastic. Tom Connors the same. Tucky Bates, Boston Herald honorable mention. Gene Correa, honorable mention, Boston Herald. Joel Howie, Boston Herald honorable mention. And just the team, the 65 team, was selected by the online voting, and the newly founded Millis High School Athletics Hall of Fame as the first football team to be inducted. Jay Monahan was also elected as an individual to the Hall of Fame in the first ballot. At the banquet that we had in the high school cafeteria, Joe Bellino, who had won a Heisman Trophy at Navy and was a Patriot player as a receiver, was the guest speaker. Joe Bellino and Coach Nelson were teammates at Winchester High School. Dave Wilson from Medway was Mr. Nelson's very capable assistant coach. After the undefeated season, the three coaches moved on, taking positions in different programs around the state, and Millis hired a future Hall of Fame coach in Millis and a Massachusetts Hall of Fame coach named Ernie Richards, who, along with Paul Duca and Andy Marak, who the gymnasium in the current high school is named in memory of, they continued the success and the groundwork that was put down by Nelson's previous 4 years. The league was now called the Tri-Valley League, moving on from the South Central League, and it was comprised of Millis, Medway, Medfield, Dover, Sherburne, Holliston, and Hopkinton. Leicester and Grafton had been in the South Central League, but they moved on, and we played non-league games with teams like Norton, Georgetown, anyone that we could get on our schedule. And Coach Richards continued with very good teams who won much more than they lost. And the games with Medfield and Medway were very pivotal with the league championship usually resulting in who won most of them between these three teams. Ernie's first team in 1966 beat Medway 42-6 for victories in 3 successive years, and for the first time in school history, we retired the American Legion Trophy to the Millis High School trophy case. Tom Connors, Rusty Cushman co-captained the team with many of the previous mentioned 65 team as key members, along with upcoming underclassmen Jack O'Rourke, Gordon Brown, Paul Davis, Brian Warren, Tom Clancy, Tom McDonough, Lee Barrett, Joe Costello. And that group of seniors finished their 3 years with a 23-3 record. The teams of the 70s continued the success of Millis. Players during that time, including Dennis Breen, Lee Barrett, Jack O'Rourke, a few that I've mentioned before, Paul Davis, Kevin McCarthy, Tim and Mike Hislop, Dave Andonian, Gary Warren, Dave and Eric Elison, Greg Monahan, Greg McGann, Scott Jordan, Bob Yeard. It could go on forever. The Cannon family had 4 brothers that played in the 70s, Dick, Ken, Bob, and Ted. All were skilled players and good teammates. Richard Monahan was a very gifted athlete and quarterback for 3 years in the early 70s, and Richard was also elected to the Millis Hall of Fame as an individual. Joe McLaughlin was another outstanding player from that era. Gordon Brown would go on to play at Boston College and become the first Tri-Valley League player ever drafted into the NFL, being selected by the New York Jets. In 1975, another important person in Millis football history entered the picture, assistant coach Dave Sparandio. The 79 team won the Tri-Valley League title, losing only to Westwood 14-10. The captains were Bruce Carter, Bob McKinnon, and Bob Barbera. Coach Richards and Sparandio had a juggernaut in 1980. Many of the players from the 79 team included. The team went 11-0 and won the D4 Super Bowl, beating Wareham at Boston College 19-9. Jimmy Cannell was named the Boston Globe Division IV Player of the Year and went on to play at Tennessee for the legendary coach Johnny Majors. Ernie Richards was the D4 Coach of the Year. Billy Lagos, Tri-Valley All-Star, Milford News All-Star, Boston Globe D4 All-Star, John Monahan, similar awards. Billy Congdon, similar awards. Richard Vellante, Joe Kerwin, Scott Collins, Chucky Barbera, all Tri-Valley League and Milford News All-Stars. Paul Schuker, John Della Porta, Peter Turgeon, Ed Field, all All-Stars. Mark LaCroix, Shiners All-Star. 1980 was the second football team elected to the Millis Hall of Fame, with Jimmy Cadell, John Monahan, and Billy Lagos also inducted into the Millis Hall of Fame as individuals. Other notable players on that 80 team were Jim Riley, John St. Cyr, Alan Richards, Tim Smith, Peter Turgeon, Gordy Angel, and John Della Porta, with a backup quarterback and important place kicker, Ted Cannon. Ernie Richards left Millis after the 1986 season and was replaced by Wally Quigg. Quigg's teams had many talented players, but their records never seemed to coincide with the team's talent. One notable game during the Quigg era was the 1989 Thanksgiving game with Medway, which was played in a snowstorm, blizzard pretty much. Medway came out on top. I think the score was 6-0, and there was only one other game in eastern Massachusetts played on that day in Thanksgiving. All the other ones were postponed and played either Friday or Saturday. Dave Sperandio returned in 1994 and took a one-win team from the previous year and won the Super Bowl. Brian Kraby, a co-captain on that team, would eventually become a head coach in Millis. Other captains on that team were Mike Levy and Brandon Davidson. Matt Rizzuti was the QB. Other players included Joe Santillo, P.J. McMahon, Dale Bickford, Adam Capola, and Andy Marchione, and also Mark Cofield, a teacher and later on coach. The 95 team probably should have been in a Super Bowl, but they were eked out by the system. They were deserving, just didn't get there. Coach Sperandio's teams always were well coached, competitive, skilled, and prepared. The 99 team, with him as coach, resulted in another Super Bowl victory, and that was led by Hall of Fame QB Brian Egie, and they brought us into the next millennium with a Super Bowl victory. Sperandio retired from coaching in 2005. Dave was also inducted into the Hall of Fame as a coach. Dale Olmsted took the helm, followed by the Olsen twins, Dale and Dana. Then former player, captain, and longtime assistant coach Brian Kraby. Brian stepped down as head coach after 2 years, becoming an assistant and once again organizing a middle school team that went undefeated for 2 years. Bob Martellio succeeded Kraby and is currently the head coach. In the 2009 preseason, the Millis program faced a serious crossroads. Numbers were so low that there was a doubt that a team could be fielded. Rumors circulated that the program was done, and we would have to co-op with either Dover Sherburne, Medway, or Norfolk Aggie. Nobody in Millis wanted that. A prominent alumnus came forward. Dennis Breen, a member and captain of the 1968 team and the Hall of Fame team from 65, was the principal at Hopedale High School. He was a 68 graduate of Millis and one of Millis's all-time great football players and a Hall of Fame member. He, along with then Millis athletic director Chuck Grant, found a way to join the two towns together and form a co-op team. The plan worked famously well. Back-to-back Super Bowl wins in 2016 and 2017 resulted behind the leadership of the Olsens in quarterbacking of Bryce Latosic, probably the most prolific touchdown passer Millis has ever seen. Millis was practically unstoppable. Receivers Brian Espinette, P.J. Adams, Raymond Hillier, backs Kurt Hopkins, Dominic Zomfrelli, and Jack Moriarty operated behind the line with Kevin Pine, Dan Fallon, Hayden Olmsted, Saran Horahan, and Ryan Daniel. Chris Edwards and Andrew Brooks both were excellent place kickers. The defense with Thomas Fallon, Steve Melia, Andrew Brooks, and Alex Olmstead, and many of the other previous mentioned offensive players usually held the opposition to very few points. The 2017 team had many of the same players who repeated as Super Bowl winners. Other impactful notable players in this era were Josh Pierre Charles, who later played at Nichols College, John Baker, who played at BC, Bay Tagney, Jimmy Perkins, the Duffy brothers, Tom and John, Tom and John's father, Tom Duffy, who was a great player for Needham and at Tufts, was a Millis assistant coach during this period of time. The next few years had numbers issues once again as the Tri-Valley League athletic directors voted to disband the co-op with Hopedale. Cravy's success with the middle school team, which I had mentioned went undefeated for 2 years, and Coach Martellio's leadership rekindled the interest in the program. The 2024 team is heavy with talented sophomores and freshmen, with the few juniors and seniors making significant contributions. Millis had 2 consecutive wins on Thanksgiving, and leading up to the game this year can retire the Legion Trophy once again with a victory. Current players for Millis include sophomores Liam Craby, Owen Caulfield, Jack Carter, Brody Barrett, Captain Vinnie Sellers, Pat Halloran, Dylan McGuire, Franco Barasano, Matt Noonan, Chuck Smith, and James Dugan. Hopefully they can take care of business on Thanksgiving and bring home a win. The future looks bright for this group. They're almost all sophomores. They'll hopefully all be back together, and who knows what the next 2 years can bring. This is the first attempt to chronicle some of the highlights, details, and facts from the 100 years of Millis High School football. Corrections, additions, criticism is welcome. Information was gathered from yearbooks, newspaper articles, pictures, conversations with players and coaches past and present, residents of Millis, game programs, many old town reports, and personal observation. If you would like to contribute in the future to this ongoing project, you can contact me at rustycushman@verizon.net. Thank you for watching.